let me say 2 words about why we're having this session. It will be then moderated by Giulia Porino from Finance Watch. She will elaborate a bit more, but just want to tell a bit of the story. So when we devised this Dolphins project, we were looking into the literature and what has been done and not done, and one of the topics, one of the themes that was recurrent is the following. There is a number of policy areas, and in particular financial stability, but also the question of how to channel funds towards sustainable projects, where what you recognize is that one of the issues is the policy-making process itself. And in there, the lack of sufficient involvement of the civil society in how these policies, how the rules of the game are designed, seems to be crucial. So this is why we started this is why we included this as a pillar in the Dolphins project, a stream of work looking at the question of how you can engage citizens more into finance, and in particular into sustainable finance. So to summarize, the vision is you can't have sustainable finance without getting people involved at a large scale, so civil society in particular. And then if you look around, you realize, well, the current involvement is very low. So then the question becomes, what are the barriers and how can you overcome those barriers? So this is what is the motivation behind this session, and this is what the session aims to shed light on. Having said that, I give the floor to Giulia Porino, moderator of the session. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Thanks a lot. Good afternoon, everybody. My pleasure to be here. My name is Giulia Porino. I represent today Finance Watch. For who doesn't know who we are, is a civil society organization created in 2010, so in the aftermath of the financial crisis, under an initiative of a group of progressive members of the European Parliament that recognized the unbalanced representation of interest existing in the policy and regulatory process at the European level. And that this was particularly strong and a massive issue in the aftermath of the European crisis, where at the global, European and also national level, we were trying to fix a system that created so much damage to society at large. What we are doing now as Finance Watch is being the convener of a change finance campaign that we hope to become global, to create a platform of civil society actors coming from different backgrounds and fostering an interdisciplinary approach as much as possible to discuss together how to reform the financial sector, and more broadly than that, how to discuss on how the role of finance in our economic paradigm needs to be rethink in order to ensure that the public interest is reflected in our economic paradigm. I don't need to stress again how the momentum around sustainable finance is strong. It seems that everybody is talking about it, global level, European level, national level, academics, practitioners, of course the industry. And yet, civil society engagement is low. And why it's low? And the thing that surprised me most is that actually citizens should be among the main actors interested in making sustainable finance work for society. And why? Because citizens, taxpayers, have been the one that paid the higher bill right after the crisis with the bailout of banks, and in the 10 years that followed with the economic crisis. So why it's so complicated to engage citizens and civil society at large in the debate about the role of finance and how to shift it in with a positive narrative and a positive spin for all of us. So to make a parallel, why we cannot mobilize people around finance, as, for example, is happening with climate change, where the narrative is different, where the attention shifts. So the aim of this panel, so that's the background I just proposed. So, of course, the idea of this panel, so where we start, is that finance, as I said, is a difficult topic to engage with. And so as a researcher, as an expert, but also as a practitioner, we want to understand which are the barriers that are actually preventing this broader engagement. And also this is the aim of the panel, among the aims of the panel, is to understand which are the ingredients that we can change or add in the way we work and in our work, so the way also we work together as, again, academics, practitioners, civil society, to change the status quo. How we were going to do that? We will provide 5 cases today with 5 speakers, providing both empirical and theoretical example about this kind of barriers and how they can be overcome. The exercise that we decided to do together with my amazing colleagues here was to rethink about their work and the way they structure their work and the outcome they got from their work by asking themselves basically 2 main questions. So, based on your research, during your work, what are the most important barriers you are able to identify or you faced in engaging citizens in sustainable finance? And it was not an easy one to respond at all, because it might look as a fact that we see, and data show them. Luisa will also explain it more in depth. But why it's happening? So which are the causes that are at the root of these issues that, of course, we have to tackle? So we try to cluster them in 3 main boxes, let's say. And of course, the research can be further explored, and that is our hope for next steps. Of course, there is complexity of finance and sustainable finance, so initial narrative, language. So it's a challenge also for economics, for experts. The way economics is taught, the way finance is communicated, the message behind it, the language we use. Trust, this is an heritage from the crisis. We are celebrating this year the quite sad anniversary of 10 years after the crisis. So, does people trust now the financial sector? Is the perception changed, or we are still in the same situation as 10 years ago with poor improvement in general? And then access. Is sustainable finance really a tool that is usable for the average citizens? Or there is an entry level, let's say, even if hidden perhaps or opaque, that impede sustainable finance to become basically mainstream? And others, like, for example, values, beliefs. And then the second questions. So, that's the second question we will ask to panelists today. Do you see any alternatives already in your project or in your research, or perhaps in further research you might run in the future to overcome this barrier? So we are opening here also a new research, in a way, stream. Why not? Let me be ambitious. So, speakers and main topics. As I said, what we try to stress is to be interdisciplinary as much as we can, mixing theoretical and empirical approaches. So we will have Armin Haas opening, professor at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, with a focus on financial markets and their role for sustaining the economy, society, and environment. So the best way to start our discussion and challenge ourselves. Boris Sloban, postdoc at the Zurich University, with the analysis of the European Commission consultations and data on lobby activities aiming at looking for a more inclusive and participatory policy-making process, and I have to say this is particularly important for Finance Watch, for example, as a study, since, as I said at the beginning, we've been created also to tackle this lack of participatory engagement from civil society in the policy-making process. Third speaker, Amsa Zeytinoglu, senior researcher at Burford University, with an application, so here we became empirical, on values, beliefs, and worldviews on influencers and citizens. Luisa De Amicis, Plus Value, another practical and empirical analysis on the structure of the social network of actors investing in sustainable finance and, of course, on impact investing more specifically. And last but not least, Anna Kicker from the Young Foundation, with a presentation of the outcome from a UK-based citizen engagement campaign on credit assessment and worthiness. So I'm very pleased to have such a great panel together with me today. What I can say before leaving the floor to Armin is that Finance Watch cannot welcome more this initiative and this way of structuring this discussion, because it goes exactly in the same direction we want to pursue with the creation of this Change Finance campaign and this Change Finance platform, in order to gather together different approaches, different dialogues, to find together as a civil society a new narrative to ensure that what happened 10 years ago will not happen again, and that the chances to really build up a sustainable finance that is meaningful for society and really work for society is actually something that will happen now. Thank you very much for your attention. Just one more word about the structure of the panel. We will have the 5 presentations in a row, so I will ask you to hold your questions unless there is something very urgent you would like to ask. Then we're going to have, of course, the question and answer also with the Slido questions involved. And then a final wrap-up and a final statement from each speaker to leave up with a takeaway. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julia, for giving me the floor. So I need this one and the presentation. Me?
Yeah.
Ah, perfect. No, all fine. All fine, thanks. So, my presentation is entitled Fragile, Handle with Care, and I'm speaking about the global financial system. So, I think if we want to see the sustainability transition happen, we better make sure that the financial markets are able to finance them. Because if they are not going to finance the sustainability transition, this will not happen. So operational financial markets are a precondition for the green transition. So what does it mean, operational? It means they must be operational economically and they must be accepted socially. These are the 2 dimensions that are fundamental if we want to go for the third, the ecological dimension. Now, the challenge is that the system is fragile, or the way how we our scientific writing is that it is a system that is self-organizing or autopoietic, as the theorists like to call that. It's self-referential. It's based on debt claims. The whole thing is expanding, it's growing, and unstable. Now, do you recognize this? Have you ever seen that? Does it somehow resonate with you? It's 10 years ago, 9.5 years ago. This was on a Sunday after Lehman collapsed. It was Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, and her finance minister, Peer Steinbrück, in TV, guaranteeing the saving deposits of German citizens. And it worked. It did the trick. It stabilized the system and it prevented the bank run. So it worked this time. And it's important, it is the most recent example, so this thing and all the other rescue operations, of something that basically happens every century. A financial bubble bursting, leaving the system in despair, and the politicians need to somehow rescue the system. It's basically a necessity because the whole thing is unstable. And now there is a big challenge. So the politicians must step in and rescue the system, but they can actually not really tell the people why they are doing it. They cannot justify their actions. Why not? Because when they seriously want to justify why they stepped in, they would need to explain to their citizens that the whole system is fragile and unstable. But if they would tell that, they would risk to trigger panic and a bank run and the breakdown of the system, so they can't. And that's a catch-22. And that's a barrier, a big barrier for engaging citizens. Now, what can we do? Well, at least I'm an economist and I'm an academic. And I think my role is to educate, first of all, my own discipline, and hopefully then the discipline can educate the citizens. That may sound arrogant, but we have a challenge out there. Why? Because the thing is, money is created on the base of credit. All money is credit. And most of the credit is privately created. And the big chunk of what is privately created is actually created offshore. This means it's dollar created in Europe, in Zurich, for example, or in Frankfurt, or in London, or in Japan, in Tokyo. This means outside of the jurisdiction that actually issues the unit of account, the dollar, which is the US. That's a big elephant in the room, and it's mostly just ignored. And the other big elephant in the room is called shadow money. This is near money, money substitutes, and you can read just 4 of the most important ones: money market funds, repos, asset-backed commercial papers, and foreign exchange swaps. And that's a big thing. It's another elephant in the room. And economic textbooks generally ignore all of that, which is remarkable. But these things have consequences for the way how the system is set up and works. And we better take note of that and take it serious. So now, within the Dolphins project, we were responsible for coming up with scenarios for the future of the global financial system. Now, a scenario exercise is not foretelling the future. It's not a crystal ball that you can use for looking into what's going to happen. But what is it instead? Well, it's 4 things that scenarios can accomplish. First of all, it's about exploring the space of possibilities. And definitely this is not exhaustible, so we cannot explore everything that is possible, but something that is possible. And by doing this, you can inspire thinking. And you can, if you're lucky, trigger a process of social learning. And one of the most fascinating aspects of it, you can identify bifurcation points in the social system, in the social ecological system. And our major bifurcation point in our exercise was, will we see a big financial crisis between now and 2040? And with big, we mean a crisis that is sufficiently big to blow the system, to sink the system. Yes or no? Well, if not, well, then we are going to see business as usual. And business as usual means typically when you read the newspapers or read academic journals, it's either the dominance of the dollar continued, or it might be a multipolar system with the dollar and the euro and the renminbi and then some regional spheres of dominance somehow interacting. This vision, for example, you can read in the just published book of Barry Eichengreen. But this is basically not a surprise. This is what is discussed in academia and in the civil society. The interest, and we call that it's the evolutionary path. So in a way, it's continuous development, one way or the other. The more interesting part is the other one, what we call the revolutionary path. Because here we just assume there will be a big crisis sinking the system. And sinking the system will mean anarchy, chaos. And we had a rough idea of what it means in 1929 in the 30s, because then there was quite some suffering economically, because the economy did not work any longer properly. And now, just imagine in our times, that won't be fun. Okay. Now, will the G20 be able to fix it or not? If not, well then, we just continue with chaos and anarchy, and that won't be fun, and I hope that we can avoid it and fix it. But what does it mean to fix it? And just to give you an idea what it could mean, we developed one scenario that we call the International Monetary Federation, and we got inspired by the thinking and the writing of Keynes, because the British government entrusted Keynes with the task of conceiving a post-war international financial order in 1941. And he delivered, and he basically conceived the whole system of institutions. And in the midst of this system of institutions, there was his International Clearing Union. Have you ever heard of the clearing union idea of Keynes? Okay, well, at least some have, but it's not common knowledge. So most people have never heard about that, because it's not taught to economists any longer. This is just irrelevant for today's economics curriculum, which is remarkable in itself. Now, the ICU was never implemented. We got Bretton Woods, we got the World Bank, we got the IMF. However, the ICU inspired the European Payment Union of the 50s. Has anyone ever heard of the European Payment Union? Okay, one. That's not, it could be worse. This is something that is almost completely forgotten, which is amazing, because it is the practical test of Keynes' ideas in Europe, and it worked perfectly. That's the reason why we abolished it. Because in those times, the countries had the goal to get their currencies convertible, and this is what the European Union actually accomplished. So, and therefore they scrapped it, which I think is a pity. But at least it gives you an idea how it could be looking like to reset the system after the big crash. And we are not predicting that it will be this way. We're not even advising that it's the best way, but it's at least a conceivable way of how a reset could be looking like. And if you want to know more, we have written that up in a paper. Just ask me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armin. Wow, citizens don't know because they're not supposed to know, otherwise what will happen? Wow, that's scary. But actually, I think, if I might say something on your defense, that you've been too hard with yourself by saying about arrogancy, being arrogant, because I think that actually it's kind of humble, because to rethink about economics, and you are an economist, you first have to question yourself. So I think that this is the good way to go, and I hope that many other experts and academics will follow you as. So thank you very much. Okay, so Borut, next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so hello, I'm Borut Sluan, and I'm here from the University of Zurich at the Finexus Center, and I'll be talking about data-driven policy co-creation. So it's about if we want to go into the future and to have a sustainable finance, we have to think of the changes that need to be made, and some of those are new policies, new regulations, and I'll try to say a few words how we think it could be made better in order to include citizens in this process. So we start off with policies, and if I give here a vague, let's say, definition, those are basically principles for and regulations of conduct. And they're mostly written down by governments or regulatory bodies, and they apply to the industry sector, to organizations, and to the general public. But so how are they actually created? Again, a very simplified scenario. Mostly they're triggered by initiatives from a group of stakeholders affected by those future policies. For example, an industry sector or public organizations or social activist group, something like this. And then typically the policymakers consult a limited number of experts and the largest directly involved stakeholders. And they issue a new policy proposal. Voila. So, but in a way, this may leave citizens underrepresented, and there might be a lack of transparency in this, assuming this is the simplified view of how things work. So coming back to this figure, and we see that it would be, in a way, better if both the industry organizations and the general public could influence the entire process of creating the policies. So that's where we come to policy co-creation. And policy co-creation is, as I said, involving citizens and stakeholders in the process. So, but aren't politicians supposed to do this? I mean, they're elected by people to do this, and in the end, do they really know what citizens want? I'll leave these questions open now for you to think about, but let's consider another thing, that governments around the world, they are in a way desperately trying to increase the citizens' trust in their institutions. They want to increase the transparency of the policy-making process, and they want to increase the policy acceptance. So what's a way that they try to tackle this? One of the ways are public consultations. Public consultations take place all over the world. For example, this is the Australian webpage of the public consultations. There's the UK webpage or the European Commission's webpage on public consultations. So it's about engaging citizens. But how well does it really work? Well, public consultations, on average, get a few hundred of responses. And mainly they are by the largest lobbying organizations that are active in this area that affects them. But unfortunately, the public consultations fail to engage really the broader public into responding. And that's what we think is one of the barriers that the general public does not engage, is the thing that the communication needs to be improved and the knowledge representation needs to be improved. There are various reasons why some institutions don't want this to happen, but in order, let's put this aside, so if we want to engage more people, we think we have to do this, because it's hard to understand for people the social, economic consequences for them, or even it's difficult to engage them if they don't know how this will affect their daily lives. And so that's why we believe that information is crucial to make the public more aware of the implications on their daily lives. And we want to do this. We propose how to overcome this barrier is by proposing a policy co-creation framework, which would be a three-stage iterative process. So it would start off with the assessment of policy issues by the policymakers and the experts, and they would issue a survey or a consultation for the major stakeholders. Those major stakeholders would provide their responses, and we would gather, those responses should be gathered and presented in a way, let's say, like policy network maps. I'll come to this in a moment. And this is a representation of the positions of stakeholders towards policy issues. So this can be then represented in terms, let's say, of an infographics that can be used to trigger the public debate. So if we launch this on social media and the internet, it can foster the debate on the policy issues. And by monitoring the social response online, this can be assessed and modeled, so we can model the leaning of the public towards these issues and feed this back to the policymakers. And this process can be repeated until a satisfactory level of support for the policy is reached, and then the policymakers can issue a policy proposal. So I want to go here into how do we think or envision that these infographics, how to visualize stakeholder responses and how to model or show the leaning of the public towards the policy issues. So visualizing stakeholder responses can be made by the concept of policy network maps. That's a concept we're developing. And mostly it's basically about, you have stakeholders on, you want to show stakeholders and the policy issues, and you want to show whether they're supporting those policy issues or they're opposing them. And this can be already used as a feedback to policymakers, but also, as I said before, as a medium to foster public debate on social media. And coming to a real example where we are having in our ongoing work, it's on the European 2030 Energy and Climate Framework consultations. And here we made an interactive online interactive interface for people to see this. There they can explore and see that, for example, we make this layout, we compute it, and we see that on top, for example, we can have the issues that are mostly opposed by organizations positioned on the left side. And on the bottom, we have policy issues that are agreed with from the organization position on the left side and vice versa on the right side. So people can also explore this, see the individual organizations, what they are, what is their turnover, number of employees, and so on and so forth. So, but another way would also be to visualize stakeholder responses in terms of similarity networks. So basically taking in account only the responses that they provide to the consultations. And if we show an example that we have from the consultations on banking and finance, this was a consultation on corporate tax transparency. So basically we can see here two larger clusters of, and we see that on the left-hand side, mostly trade associations and companies and groups tend to reply similarly, whereas on the other side, on the right side, the cluster includes similar responses from NGOs and trade unions. So you see that there is a pattern that emerges from how organizations, different types of organizations think about different policies. And of course, we can make this also explorable, so people can compare, for example, here Finance Watch and BlackRock, and see on which questions what did they answer, where did they match, where they didn't. So, but when we have such a representation of the major stakeholders and how they think about things, we can go on to spark the debate, start the discussion, the public discussion about those issues. And then when we collect those tweets, those posts that people publish on the net, we can identify the major groups of actors that are active in this area. We can detect what they talk about, and we can assess the leanings that they have towards those issues. And just to give you an example that this can really be done, that I'm not really making things up, I'll show an example of some of our previous work where we did this on a slightly broader domain of environment, sustainability, energy, and finance. And there we found out this is a network of Twitter users where we model their retweeting behavior. So the bigger nodes show the amount of retweetedness of this user, And the colors of the nodes show the communities we identified of those users. So there are certain communities that we found who were active on environment. There are some, the ones that we called skeptic, because they were skeptic towards global warming. And there are various also different communities about just news or locally active, like the ones about India. And when you have this data, you can go to see what the individual communities think about. And we can assess their leaning. So for example, for having a number of topics, a selection of topics, we can see a general trend going over all the communities, or even see some exceptions, like the skeptics, the community that was skeptic towards global warming. And here we see that it's not really that negative towards fossil fuels or towards fracking. So things can be seen from what people post online. So let me here conclude what we believe is valuable for coming towards a future of sustainable finance. We propose an iterative policy co-creation framework that is supported by data and network analysis, and it consists of assessment of policy issues, mapping the stakeholder positions, and then initiating a public debate about these issues and modeling those issues. And then they can go into the loop of refinement. So by improving the communication and the knowledge representation to the public, this leads to an efficient policy co-creation cycle, and we believe that feasible and sustainable policies can be co-created with the synergy of policymakers and the civic society. So I would like to thank you here.
Thank you very much, Borut. So if I may briefly wrap up, I think that here we are talking about regulatory capture and how to undo or at least rebalance the influence of the financial industry to also trying to avoid that basically they self-regulate themselves. And I think that also this debate of finance and sustainability is particularly important to stress that. Because we see, and again with the crisis, how the impact on the social and environmental dimension is actually dramatic if it's not regulated in public interest. Thank you very much. I see already answer ready. So unless there is any urgent comments on this or questions on these first two speakers, no? Okay.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. I will be presenting on memes, values, and worldviews. Again, you know, coincidentally, Armin was talking about the elephant in the room. This is another elephant that we have, which is somehow overlooked generally in the way that we approach citizen engagement. And we had the hard lesson, you know, as Borut explained in his presentation when we went over the consultations in the Simple project and throughout Dolphins. There's a challenge that we need to address, and luckily in the next projects that I've also been involved in, we've tried to tackle this question, and it's a work in progress. I'm going to try to explain to you the state of the art and how we're approaching it, and to see if we can forge alliances in terms of cracking this issue. So basically, what we start from is that subjective truth is there, of course, but the objective truth that we can lead towards, there are some deterministic things that are in play. And when we talk about the dialogic here, it is much more about where people are coming from in terms of their values and beliefs and their worldviews. And most of the time we have difficulty aligning these and building venues for collaboration and coalitions. So the same graph that Borut was talking about, this is where we all started, and during the Simple project, it was quite a challenge to be able to identify the routes that we can find to be able to engage citizens. So the take that we had, and already there was hinges on this, we had been working on this with Stefano for more than 10 years, and the idea that we have to put centralized values into our work was very important. And in the recent years, we've also seen a lot of attention going in that kind of direction, and we're very happy with that, and we're trying to influence. So I just want to, you know, for all of you that might not have paid too much attention to this, basically, we want to be able to map, let's say, our topic here, our specific topic in this generic landscape, sustainable finance, how that would map to the value systems. I have a definition of memes down there, both definitions, one with the 9gag popular version, and the first one is what we're more interested in. Basically, how we approach it is that memes are actually the building stones of values. And values, in turn, lead to value systems that people have that they cherish in their lives and they carry forward. And usually, there is limited change in what people have in their value systems. So there are determinants in this. And in those determinants, you can see like language, religion, geography, politics, tradition, survival. And we would call that the ecology, where the value system is thriving. Now, here I have a little YouTube video. I hope it works. You might be familiar with the World Values Survey from Michigan. And this has been in the works since the early 80s. And eventually, it has turned into a global survey spanning more than 80 countries. And this is a landmark application that they've had where you can see the Orthodox, the Confucian, the Catholic, Europe, Protestant, English-speaking, the Latin American, African, Islamic. And in those shaded areas, you can see the countries marked. Now, in this video, it's really nice, the work of Engelhardt. From 1981 to 2000, oops, it didn't work. Let's see, I'll try again. Yes. So this will start from 1981. You can maybe pay attention to what's happening, for instance, with Germany here and the United States. In the growing years, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that these value systems, the values, they map dynamically. Here you have the traditional values and the secular rational values dimension, and you have the survival values and the self-expression values. And you can see how dynamically these things evolve. So it is not a static picture that we're looking at. It is something that we need to track dynamically. So let me see. Okay. When it comes to the values, dimensions, and evaluations, we call it psychosocial profiling. Mostly it's referred to as psychometrics. I've mentioned a few here. One of them that you see here is Salom Schwartz's work on the PVQ, the Portrait Values Questionnaire, based on the theory of basic human values. And openness to change, self-enhancement, conservation, self-transcendence are the core dimensions, with the self-direction, stimulation, hedonism, achievement, power as the sub-dimensions that they use. You can read them here. You have the Enneagram coming from the number 9 in Greek. This is much more, I would say, people that are more oriented towards spiritual existence, they prefer to use this one more, but it's still a very valid system. Ocean, the Big Five, actually Guido mentioned that during his flagship presentation, where this is what Cambridge Analytica used. And for those of you who might not be familiar, basically during the Brexit campaign, during the Trump election, Ted Cruz is trying to be a contender for president. Cambridge Analytica, actually based on the work of some French scholars, they used Facebook especially to be able to get the psychosocial profiles, psychometric profiles of people based on these 5 dimensions. We start with the OCEAN, the Big Five, and they had this targeted campaign done. This was based on this scientific work, basically. Here we have the Myers-Briggs, one of the most popular ones based on the Jungian archetypes. You can see the extroverts, introverts, sensors, intuitives, thinkers, feelers, judgers, and perceivers. And on the left-hand side, we have my favorite, the Clare Graves Dudley Lynch spiral model, which is a much more dynamic system as we perceive it. So we are actually trying to compare all of these and to be able to find out in the next 6 months, 9 months, what would be a more applicable one. I'm just going to ask you really fast. How many of you have ever taken one of these tests or something similar? Quite a few, yeah. So think of the individual experience that you have and how that compares to any other peers that you might have been interacting about these things. So how you map yourself and how your perception about, say, sustainable finance is something that we can analyze and almost deterministically predict. That is the core of this exercise. So what we do. Right now we have this, well, it's not out there publicly, but it's within our project for our registered members. We use this in this OpenMaker project. And also we're applying this to the Dolphins' work in the last 6 months. It's just work in progress. Basically what we do in the Watchtower is harvest data from various social media sources. So similar to, again, the flagship project that we're talking about, there are multiple places where those 5 individuals keep the data of the public, the citizens, but also all of these data can be integrated into certain databases, and we can actually analyze them across. So what we get here is, for instance, Twitter data. We have Reddit for conversations. We have Eventbrite, and we're adding more and more social media sources so that we can track and combine, get comprehensive results. So what we do is we look at the topics here, starting in Twitter, and then we have the audiences, which is basically people that are following the influencers and our targets that we would want to connect to. The news that are in there, including the full text of these, and we can analyze them based on semantics and other tools, and events. So we're trying to get the whole landscape out there, and what we do is harvest the data, extract all of these news, influencers, audiences, events, conversations, and the memes that I was mentioning before. We're mapping them to psychosocial profiles, identifying the trust dynamics, because with this kind of data, it's readily easy to infer on this, and look at the access and spread of data. So, just a second. It goes best with white wine. Here we have another application that we're working on, which is called the Spirometer. It's actually simply a ranking system where we did in this last couple of weeks in preparation for this conference. We looked at the followers of the Simple Project Twitter accounts, which is around 630 as of this morning. Maybe it's increased today, we hope. And we look at the recent 200 tweets. Now, the dimensions that we've identified, just as a mock-up basically, sustainability, climate, social impact, finance, and innovation. And what we're doing out of these 630, we are ranking the top 42. The reason that we chose 42 is actually, last night we were working with my colleague. It looked like the map of the galaxy, so we said, you know, we'll just go for the Hitchhiker's Guide of the Galaxy's secret number. Right now it's just 42 to keep it simple. Here we have our main actor that we chose with the code name Sbattis on Alliance Sbattis on Twitter, which is Stefano Battiston here. And we can see that his greatest interest is around sustainability, going down with climate, social impact, finance, and innovation, which innovation you need to work on, Stefano, obviously. He's on the phone. Okay. So, and when it comes to the community spirometer, we can see where Stefano is in the circle. These are the guys that have the highest points, and going down into the spiral, it's ranked descending order. You can also have the same thing for the whole dimension, so the total of all scores. So for instance, for Stefano, we have 1.448 as a score, whereas the UNDP Climate Finance and Governance Group here has 3.784. So this is a matter of ranking people based on what they are tweeting and based on the keywords that they're using. Yeah? So this is a work in progress, and we will be publishing on Memescapes quite soon. So just to wrap up, oh, I've already passed my time. Basically, in terms of addressing the core issues of this session, for complexity, we think that translating complexity to the layperson language is very important. This was actually one of the take-home messages from the last Finexus, the first and last recent Finexus meeting. And it's important to map the perceptions of the citizens on the importance and urgency of the issue that we choose, which is here sustainable finance, because this will point to action for them. So it's important in the trust that we build on the similarities that we can map which can be values and beliefs, interests, skills, and experience, that actually breed trust. But on the other hand, even when similarities are absent, or especially when they're absent, that we also go for the complementarities that people have, okay? And for the access dimension, I would say the personalized recommendations for sustainable investment opportunities, and this independent from the social and economic status of the citizen, because we need to make them subjects of this whole system. And the rest is about the making the communications based on the values of the citizens for engagement according to their preferences and capabilities. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hamza. Thank you. Well, I think that for me the main takeaway from your presentation is the importance of not missing out on multi-layered communication opportunities addressing citizen needs, values, and also perhaps also finding a way to bringing different approaches into closer dialogues by stressing complementarity between them. Thank you very much. Luisa, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. You have 10 minutes.
Maybe I should switch on the mic. Might be useful. I'll quickly go through Hamza's presentation. Pardon? Exactly. And I just wanted to briefly answer to your initial question, Julia, because you mentioned complexity as one of the key barriers and for the development of the sector. And I think that it can be also seen as an added value of the sector, because the sector, we will see in my presentation in more details, is extremely diverse. And I really wanted to emphasize this double face, if you want, because it brings a strong added value, this diversity, but as you correctly said, it can also be one of the main barriers to the development of the sector itself. And there are a number of different players with a number of different interests, and this is exactly reflected in the paper that we managed to research. So actually, before I start, I was just also to check if the audience is still awake. After lunch, it can be a bit tricky. So who knows about impact investing? Who is familiar with it? Okay, a good number of people, because recently I went in Lyon, I was in a conference and nobody knew about it. I was like, oh my God, what am I going to say now? So just for the reference of those that are not very familiar with it, we used in the paper a brief definition, which is provided by Eurosif, which is the European umbrella body for impact investing. And it reads as follows. So the working definition for the paper is impact investing is investment made into companies, organizations, and funds with the intention to generate social and environmental impact alongside financial return. And you can see in the graph that is basically everything in between traditional investment and philanthropy. Now, the lack of a universal, this is the definition we used, but what I should definitely stress is that there is as many of you probably know, there is a lack of specific definition, of universal definition for the sector. And what everybody agrees upon is that this sector is growing. So here I pointed out a few statistics from GIN, which is the Global Impact Investment Network, from Morgan Stanley, from Bloomberg, and you can see that actually the value of the market, because they try to estimate the value, has massive differences. So, for example, for GIN, we are talking in 2016 of a market size of about $110 billion, while for Bloomberg, we are talking about $23 trillion. So you can see that the scale is slightly different, I would say. So what we try to do with our paper. So looking at all the Twitters that we could collect from during a period of 4 months, we decided to try to understand how is the impact investing market growing, and especially if it receives social media attention. What are the relationship between the different categories of player, and what do they talk about? What are the key influencers and their communities? So as I said, we acquired data across 4 months, and we collected more than 234,000 tweets, about 2,200 a day, and from 83,000 users. And what we found out is that, quite surprisingly, nobody's against impact investing. So people are either neutral or supportive, which is a very good news, and it gives a lot of space of maneuver, if you want, because it's really, really encouraging. And why I say it's surprising is that because there were previous research made on climate change, for example, which for me, it's obviously something positive, but, well, no, I'm not supporting, I mean, of course I'm supporting climate change, but was quite a controversial topic. So some people were really denying that. What we have also done was trying to understand who are the most influential people, the most influential users in our data set, and we identify a group of 170 users, and as expected, we found the vast majority were practitioners or intermediaries. What was definitely more surprising was that media, academia, and public sector were also almost not there. So there was an extreme low presence of these 3 sectors. And for me, being a practitioner that has worked in the sector for the last 10 years, this came really as a surprise. And even as a little bit of a disappointment, if I can say that, because there are a number of governments, a number of international institutions that are really putting impact investing at the core of their policies, and still they don't communicate that. So I think there is a massive gap that needs to be filled in, that needs to be tackled. And the other point, here you can see a list of the 10 most influential Twitter users. And the other very surprising and striking finding was that there is no presence of media, at least of the mainstream media. So I know that there are some media here in the room, so it would be interesting to hear from some of them what they do, what are their behavior, and so it's really a call for those that are here. And another thing that I found quite surprising is that Goldman Sachs, everybody knows about them, were the 4th most influential user. In this slide, you can see the connection between users and what do they talk about. You can see a number, I'm not entirely sure you can see it, but perhaps you can try. What I found, there are a number of interesting things, but for the sake of, I'm conscious about time, you can see that private companies only talk about ESG. And this is another thing that I found quite surprising, because no private companies are talking about impact investing or social enterprises, which is another big topic. Nothing. We also looked at the communities that are around the most influential users. And here is a representation of this community. And this is, again, what are all the topics that are discussed in those communities. And here you can really see and appreciate the vast diversity of topics that are discussed. One of the last slide is about the communities and the categories. So looking at the most relevant communities, basically it's like which categories are included into that. And you can see that and this is a clear example that tell us if the different communities of impact investors are talking with each other or not. So basically we are saying, are demand and supply connected? Do they talk enough? Is there an actual dialogue between that? And again, quite surprisingly, or maybe not, it depends from the point of view, Goldman Sachs is only talking with investors, with nobody else. So not with investees, not with nobody else. When I say Goldman Sachs, in this case, I don't talk about the company specifically, but I'm talking about the community around them. So everybody who is tweeting what they say. And another point is, of course, intermediaries are across all the different communities. And the other point is that only one community covers all the different categories of player. Only one community out of 10. So again, this means communities don't talk. So media talk with themselves, investors talk with themselves, and again, there is an extremely low presence of the academia and the public sector. So the conclusions are, first of all, impact investing is growing, and that's a great news. And there is a positive common feeling about it. That's another great news. But basically, there is still a lot to do. This is especially due to language fragmentation, which is a barrier for engagement. Very often, as we have seen, communities don't talk with each other, or they have different languages, and that's an issue. And then there is little communication across the different categories. So again, how to overcome those barriers, well, we really need to focus on connecting these different categories of player. Education should play a huge role in that. Journalists sharing information should play a massive role on that. And also, for example, academics needs to work with practitioners, and this, I think, it's another important message, in order to collect evidences, which are so important in order to really make understandable and develop a common languages across the different categories. So I think events of this kind are very much useful and appreciated, so actually, thanks, Stefano. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luisa. My first reaction would be to ask you if it's reasonable to argue that complexity in finance and on the language about it is actually fitted on purpose in order to keep the discussion between closed door, and also the fact that communities does not talk together while investors do. I'm also thinking like the responsibility we have as academics, experts, practitioners to actually empowering civil society and citizens to create new narrative that they can then use to get mobilized. So thank you very much. Last but not least, Hannah from Young Foundation, thank you very much. 10 minutes, and then we open the floor to you and to Slido. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, so I'm going to present now the pilot, the outcomes of a pilot campaign that we ran for the Dolphins Project. And this was designed really to look and to test for new and more impactful ways of engaging citizens and the public in a discussion around the role of finance in our society and the ways in which the financial system creates or sustains inequalities. So I'm going to discuss the content of the campaign, how it was created and co-designed, delivered, as well as the impact of the campaign, what we learned about engaging citizens in sustainable finance in these ways. So basically the financial system is broad. It covers a lot of areas, and we were tasked with piloting a campaign to engage citizens, and it was very much, first things first is like, what area of financial inequality should we look at? we went through those broad range of topics, and after narrowing it down with the various iterations, we decided that we would look at an issue that was very current and talked about in the UK at that time. And that was about equal access to credit. Upon carrying out some background research, we came across the Credit Worthiness Assessment Bill, which was being passed through the House of Lords by Lord John Bird, the founder of The Big Issue. And this was about making rent count, and it became the focus for this campaign. So what is the campaign about, and why isn't credit currently assessed equally? In short, the core message of our campaign was about the fact that there are opportunities to borrow money and buy on credit everywhere. From the day of your 18th birthday, you're flooded with credit options, but many citizens actually don't know about how the credit assessment works and also sustains current inequalities. Particularly, we found, the Credit Worthiness Assessment Bill is about rent payers currently in the UK. Despite paying rent on time and regularly, those records don't count in their credit assessment in the same way that mortgage payments do. So the Credit Worthiness Assessment Bill was about making rent count, essentially. Because if you're a renter, which 11 million people in the UK are, and with 98% of private renters paying their rent on time, but it's not being made visible on their credit assessment, it's leading to them not having a disparity in their credit ratings. And having a lower credit rating means that you're getting access to, you're paying more to borrow money, essentially. So our campaign was to highlight this inequality, that being poor costs more, and to make rent count. So that's just to clarify. Then the research from the Resolution Foundation found that 30% of renters under 35, so Generation Rent, was spending 1/3 of their pre-tax income on housing, and almost 3/4 of the poorest non-owning millennials spend over 1/3 of their pre-tax income on housing. So this is the current kind of threshold often used as a sign of unaffordability. And you can see here our campaign, which I'm going to go into in more detail, the Make Rent Count campaign, as quoted by John Bird on Twitter, to show the need for making rent count, is that the high percentage of tenants' salaries currently spent on rent and not therefore being included in credit assessments is perpetuating inequality. So how do we go about translating this message so that we could raise awareness amongst citizens about it? So what we did is we partnered with the Big Issue, who are the biggest influencer in pushing for equal access to credit. We co-created and co-designed the campaign with our target audience, or Generation Rent, the under 35s, to ensure that the messaging was mostly as impactful to them as possible and that it resonated. We decided then to set up and share messages that we created via Facebook. This was particularly because it's free, we could create a page for free, we had access to a broad audience, and other previous research that the Young Foundation had done on high-cost credit usage in Wales had found that peer networks are strongly influential in engendering trust. So they play a strong role. So those pushing people to seek debt advice, for example, they're more likely to take that advice from friends and family rather than other sources. So that we decided to capitalize on that through using this platform. The page included all the information about the campaign, so what the current inequality was. It had a frequently asked questions page, which was all about showing information about how credit scores currently work, how renting is not counted, and how to improve your credit rating and what to do. So there's a rental exchange and how you can sign up to make your rent count. We also included regular posts and shares, some infographics that we created in the co-creation stage of this campaign design. And I'll just show you a few of them now. For example, this one is a kind of simplified infographic that we encouraged people to share via Facebook and Twitter to highlight the current inequality that the rent basically doesn't count towards credit ratings. Here's some more tweets, images that we encourage people to share because images in campaigns are typically more effective online. And we also did some work to show the current disparity where if you're buying or renting products through credit, you're paying 5 times more. So we found some examples of these and encouraged people to share and highlight the inequality. We also sent those sample tweets to key stakeholders in the industry and asked them to share to get as wide reach as possible. And we engaged with other organisations asking them to kind of create content for us through guest blogs. So I'm now going to just highlight whether this actually did engage citizens. We launched the campaign on the 27th of November last year, and the insights are from up until the 12th of January, so a 47-day period. The Facebook page reached a total of 2,875. In order to help get the campaign off the ground, we promoted the page, and you can see the kind of the impact of the paying for sponsored stories and ads that was the majority of kind of like that helped to boost the campaign. But nonetheless, there were also users did engage with the site. They started to show signs of interaction with it, despite it only having been monitored for a short period of time, or running for a short period of time. We got 80 page likes and 80 page followers, and you can see in terms of demographics that it reached our target audience of Generation Rent, the 25 to 34-year-olds. This was the top post on Facebook in terms of engagement, and so that's people commenting on it, liking it, sharing it, and clicking through. It had 78 engagements in total, and we asked citizens to tag their banks to kind of share the message, and there was clear there were lots of people doing this, and that shows that kind of the way that we translated the inequality was really felt by understood by citizens. We also encouraged sharing through Twitter. Over this 47-day period, there were 70 tweets using the hashtag. We sent out 14 tweets from our Younger Foundation account, with each post having an average impression of 15,000. And here is the top post tweet by number of impressions, and this was just shows the kind of engagement with it. So it received 19 retweets in total, 14 likes, and this was our top post by engagement rate. So that received the highest of 49 retweets. So really, it shows that we did have. It was early days of the campaign. We'd expect to run a engagement campaign for a lot longer, and this is kind of just it's early signs that citizens were engaging with it. It's qualitatively, we also received back positive feedback about how we translated this message and the inequality to citizens from the big issue, that we managed to distill a complicated message into something much more clearer. It received traction through the media. It was featured in the Big Issue magazine, and also supported by Baroness Glenys Thornton and Jenny Jones, Baroness Jenny Jones, and the ex-Education Minister, Nicky Morgan. So really, we can see here that we were starting to get traction in terms of getting key influencers and change makers on board. That's just the same Big Issue article which references that it's getting traction, and that it was finally also mentioned in the all-party parliamentary group on the poverty premium. So really kind of started to get into not only just engaging citizens and raising awareness amongst them, but starting to influence and get into the policy scene. So overall, what we learned from piloting this campaign about how to engage citizens, that some of the challenges we faced is that the current issue with the financial system is that it's very difficult. Citizens feel very disempowered to affect change currently. The system currently feels very closed. And typically, if we were effective campaigns have a call to action, and that's the thing that we really struggled with this one. Beyond raising awareness and asking the public to share the message, we didn't really have a specific call to action about changing. Secondly, the Young Foundation, we're an action and research institute, and we are of charitable status. We're not a campaigning organisation. That's certainly limited the scope of our campaign. And the Lobbying Act in the UK restricts how much charities can do around political campaigning. And because this was the creditworthiness assessment bill is part of the political process, that was a limitation. In addition, because the bill was going through kind of several readings through Parliament, and we were unaware of the timings of that. That meant that we had to delay the start of the campaign. So it has only been running for a short amount of time. So we would expect to see more engagement in terms of quantitative impact should we have run it for longer. Just in summary, then, what the pilot showed is that it is possible to kind of distill a complicated message to the public about inequalities in finance. But there's a real kind of needs there. We would propose that there is a need for financial institutions to really think about the language that they're using and how to kind of present that. From our previous research at the Young Foundation, using online peer networks is a really good way of engaging citizens with sustainable finance through building trust. And through the impact that we had in terms of engaging political influencers and change makers, it was really starting to show that it is possible for citizens to affect change in policy.
Thank you, Hannah. I think that, again, here it's about complexity, language, narrative, and I think that what you said at the beginning, so the investigation, the way you investigate the role of finance in our society, and the fact that 10 years after, again, is still finance inequality, is still too powerful, and basically is still acting with the same mechanism of financialization of our economy that led us to this situation where we are now. I think there is a food for thought for all of us, so thank you very much. I would like now to open the floor both to the audience and to Slido. Thank you. So if I can say, yeah, 1, 2, okay, let's start in the meantime, please. Yeah. The microphone. Do we have a microphone?
It's far away, so
Thank you.
One word, I missed power asymmetry. I would say, as a citizen, I empower markets have more power than the real market. And the real market has more power than politics.
Doesn't work, the microphone? The microphone doesn't work? Sorry about that.
And as a normal citizen, I am member of Actares, that's an NGO of critical shareholders. In Geneva we have ethos, and the mechanism here is to create power by arguments and by ethical arguments. And as an individual, I have, last year I have tried to make research on 2 cases of corruption, because I think that corruption is not very sustainable. So if we fight corruption, maybe we fight in favor of sustainability. But when I published it, I became emails of lawyers in London who are defending their clients, dirty enterprises, but very rich enterprises. So we have, again, a power asymmetry. I cannot afford a sophisticated lawyer, but the firms can. And I miss speaking on that topic if we want to engage civil people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was more a comment than a question, but I would like to ask you to introduce yourself, just because I think it's important if you stress your background, because again, it gives the opportunity to... Chiara, if you can give back the microphone to the gentleman, just a sec. Because again, I think, no, but because it's an interdisciplinary link between finance and other discipline and field of expertise, so I think it's particularly important. Please, go ahead. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Thomas Kesselring. I'm coming from philosophy, and I have worked on ethics. I have taught ethics, and I have done it in African countries. Yeah. And when I was there, I observed consequences of corrupt deals. And when I discovered that Switzerland was involved, then I was interested in researching these cases. And my difficulty is really the power asymmetry. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
That's enough.
I think it was important to stress that everybody is allowed to talk about finance, not just so-called financial experts. Thank you. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
My name is Sebastian Galler. I'm from the European Business Council for Sustainable Energy. One question to Professor Haas. Do you think that this fragile situation we have, or you showed up this morning, would be less fragile with this, let's say, alternative financial universes exploring in the moment with the fintechs, with all these new alternative actors coming on the show? Or do you think this is more, or this leads to more fragile situations?
Okay, Arvin, since you already have 2 questions, I would pick also, in the meantime, also the one from Slido for you. So isn't the scenario 4 of international monetary anarchy, what is it? Thank you. The one proposed by Hayek in Private Money. So you can reply both.
Yes, so the Sligo question is the easier one to answer, because there I can say yes and no. Of course, in an anarchic world, anything goes, and you get a currency competition. So because this means then, with a financial system broken down, so everyone is on his own, every state, every company, every citizen in a way. So of course they want to dream up something that's going to work. And there will be a fierce competition, and anything goes means there's quite everything that you can think of will be tried one way or the other. So that's definitely an instance of the currency competition of Hayek. However, I read Hayek in a more cheerful, constructive sense. So he thought, well, it's a currency competition and then the world is improving and we are getting better and better. And this one is a doomsday scenario in a way. So it's yes and no. It has some aspects of it, but I think it's not the world that Hayek at least dreamed up as an ideal evolutionary path. Now, concerning the question of you, Sebastian, yeah. That's basically a $1 trillion question that you posed. No one knows that. And of course, there is a lot of hope that fancy new digital currencies fix the issue, fix the problem, and make the world stable. I'm myself rather reluctant. I would think rather not, but I could not prove it, and I'm not sure about it. And I think no one is. So I hope that it gives you a flavor of my thinking about it. I can't tell you anything else.
Thank you. There is one for AMSA, then from Slido again. So can you explain the ranking used in the solar system slide? Then we have the gentleman in the back, the gentleman in the second row, and then if you can raise their hands again, I can create the queue. Thank you.
Okay, so to answer Joe's question here, we use a simplified version for this exercise, where you basically define the universe based on the Twitter users that you want to analyze, and then you look at the dimensions, the ones that I mentioned, the 5 there, and then linked keywords to those dimensions. So what you do is you fish for these, and then based on the frequency, you produce the ranking. But a more advanced system that we're working on right now, which we have the proof of concept, is to actually use a reference corpus. So any kind of text, that every word in that text can have an affinity to a given dimension. So you basically scale it on that, and then you have a more detailed version of this. We can discuss further if you want to have more questions.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you, Julia. My name is Reza Zain Jafrali. I have various functions. It's a general question for the whole of the panel. In your various research, what have you learned about social impact bonds and what the governments and the public thought of them? Thank you.
And the gentleman here, so we collect a couple of questions.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Tony Crawford. I'm here from Canada, and I'm delighted with every session, especially this one. I'm referring to Gullible Taxpayer Law, which is a bill that is presently in the hands of a member of Parliament, and I'll get to the question. It was started from discovering what is called the Magna Carta loophole. A 104-year-old man by the name of William Krem sued the government for $1 trillion, claiming that it was wasted money in the case of these tax credits not being properly accounted for. The result of that was a lawsuit that lasted 6 years, and the judge decided that it could not be tried in court, but he advised every taxpayer to complain to their member of parliament. So my question to you is, are you following legal documents? Are you following the material that isn't tweet, that is somewhat private, very controlled? Can you get that into your dimension? Thank you.
Okay. Who is willing to respond to the two gentlemen questions? Perhaps who didn't?
Just to give a brief from my point of view, anything that's out there as news is something that we can analyze. But when it comes to the private domain, there has to be certain arrangements in place to be able to access that and then to be able to address those kinds of issues.
Shall I try to answer these two complicated questions. So related to the second one, actually, that the gentleman just asked, I would say I haven't followed it for this specific piece of research, because in this case, we were really looking at the network effect, at the complex network effect, and specifically looking at social media. However, we are strongly aware of the importance of what you are flagging. So in previous campaign, in previous work I have done and I've worked on, we were looking in details to specific documents. For example, I can remember a campaign on the financial regulation, which is an overarching regulation from the European Commission that is basically looking at all the funding that the European Commission disburses as mainly grants. And we were really working closely with all the political players involved, and specifically with the Commission that was within the Parliament in charge of that kind of file. And of course, by working so closely with the Parliament, with the Commission, with the Council, we managed to have access also to documents that are public, but in some cases, you really don't know where to look for. So they were pointing us out and they were listening to specific recommendations if we had some of those. So I found that exercise very useful, and I would be very happy to do it again in case, for example, something might emerge in other research fields. So yes, but not in this case. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Partially, okay, good. And about the second question, again, not in this specific piece of work. We haven't looked specifically into social impact bond. This was, but of course this is a very hot topic. So there are very different points of view, and to be honest, personally, I'm not necessarily a great supporter of necessarily social impact bond, also because I think we really need to make a distinction between what a bond is and what a payment by result scheme is. And I think, for example, also even the name social impact bond can create some confusion about those that are not too familiar with the topic. And you were asking about the government. Can I ask you again to repeat the second part of the question? You cannot? Okay. Yeah. Microphone.
Thank you. So what I wanted to ask was what was the perception of governments vis-à-vis social impact bonds? Yeah? Because essentially, you know that a lot of governments have to be far more efficient from an economic point of view. Social impact bonds are basically are all about government savings and taking part of the government savings, but being funded by mostly private, mostly ultra-high net worth investors. Yeah? And what is interesting about social impact bonds is that technically they are non-correlated asset class. Yeah? So I wanted to know what in your, shall I say, media review you saw was the public official vision on this. And indeed, coming back to what you were saying, social impact bonds are a bit of a misnomer because they are not bonds. They're actually privately arranged contracts between groups of investors and governments. Yeah, so it's mostly about mostly about brokerage.
Because there is another question in the queue, and then we want to close.
Fine.
Because they want to take time from the other.
10 seconds. So basically, they are privately brokered agreements between ultra-rich investors and governments.
very much. And in the meantime, if you can take the question from the gentleman in the middle, so we respond to these two questions, and then I ask the panelists to be ready with their final statement, and we close. We have 1 minute from now, so people run.
Okay, hi, I'm Andreas Dimmelmeier, I'm a PhD student. I had one question for Burut. I found that very fascinating, the network. And the question I had was, I mean, this thing depicts the consultation responses, I think, and is basically a textual similarity or a clustering of words story then who is at what point of the network. The question I had is, when it comes to the agenda setting stage in the regulatory cycle, where like to talk about, let's say, fiduciary duty reform, you can ask them in the consultation yes or no, and then there is a 5-liner. But if you want the whole backlog, like studies and reports and policy papers that have been written before that even makes it to the agenda stage, can you analyze them in a different way, or have you seen that has been done?
Well, to point you in 5 minutes to this, one of our master students was doing something on this, so I'd be glad to talk with you offline about this. Okay, thank you.
I like the approach, Bob. Thank you. Okay. Okay, final statements, starting from who is ready, whoever is ready first. Just a very short wrap-up.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer on the question about the power asymmetry and the challenges for the flagship project, for instance. What we're trying to do here is not to get the state to be able to manipulate the citizens, obviously. This is for the citizens, with the citizens, and to be able to give a mirror to each individual about what their presence is in terms of their values and beliefs, and what they can do with this in a collective fashion. So I would want to emphasize that.
Barut?
Just let's go on. So I think coming back to the barriers of citizens' engagement and what are the ways to overcome it, basically I think it's about 3 things. It's about, in a way, complexity, trust, and interest. Because if it's complex, you need to provide it to people in a more simple way. But now, is there interest to do this? Whose interest is it? I think some people want to keep it complex in order to have the unbalance of power, as it was before mentioned from the audience. And so the question is, who will be willing to do this for the citizens, for all of us? And then if somebody shows up and says, yes, I want to do this for the public, does the public trust him, really? Are those academics? Are those NGOs? Who are those people? So it's, again, a matter of trust. Whom people trust. Do they trust the government? Do they trust the NGOs? Do they trust the academia? So it's complex, but we should do it in order to have a prosperous future. Thank you.
My conclusions would be that the lack of trust kind of comes from a lack of, because of the complexity. And because of the propensity in finance to use jargon and terms that doesn't engage with citizens. So one of the ways to overcome that is to introduce guidelines and regulations around the language that's used, pushing for example, the use of the Plain English campaign guidance in the way the financial system communicates with the public. As well as penalising, which the Financial Conduct Authority are already doing in the UK, exploitative and deliberately opaque practices in the use of language by high-cost credit and exploitative lenders.
Thank you very much. Armin and Luisa?
So for me, it's actually more like a wish that I would like not to talk about impact investing anymore. And I'm not getting completely mad. I could see some weird looks. But this is because I would like impact investing to become embedded in the choice of companies, of financial institutions, so it becomes so mainstream that we don't need to differentiate that anymore.
2 years ago, the Bank of England told the public that economic textbooks get wrong how money is created. Think about that. That's interesting, isn't it? And you can read it as a sign of despair or as a sign of hope. It's a sign of despair, and you can get bitter about it, that a central bank feels the need to tell the public that we economists messed it up. However, you can also read it as a sign of hope because the Bank of England spoke out. This is the first step towards the return of reason. So I'm cheerful. I hope you join in. Thank you.
So my final statement is, so Luisa, make a wish. It's a resolution for me in the first place, to start thinking out of the box to solve these questions, so not just looking at citizens and say why you don't engage, but looking at the way we are trying or not trying, doing or not doing, to work with them and be innovative in trying to do it. So thank you very much for your attention, for Stefano, for organizing it, to the panelists and to you. Thank you very much.